it's a real connection to the land. You literally are steering and stewarding the land in a way that is not taking away from the land. And so you keep giving back and it gives back to you. But it incorporates companion planting, knowing what plants like to be together, which ones don't. And we also use moon cycle planting, so I get 3 or 4 crops. So beans, we'll be seeding beans again in the 3rd week of August, and then I'll have nice, delicious young beans for the end of September. And when temperatures are a little cooler, they do better. As well as we do 7 sister growing, which is basically a companion planting. It's a way to share how companion planting works, right? As well as we use the 4 elements. So fire is definitely in our garden in the sense of wood ash. Using the wood ash, it's a way to control any pests without hurting the land. And you ever get flea beetles, you just sprinkle that wood ash on and 24 hours they're gone. We got rid of any slugs and slug egg problem in the garden because we use the wood ash on the soil, but it also brings back to the soil the nutrients, such as your magnesiums and zinc and other things that your root vegetables take out. Because for everything that is grown, it takes out of the soil, but if you're not putting stuff back in, you end up being like the Western way of adding fertilizers and chemicals and everything else, which eventually totally depletes the soil to the point that you can't grow anything without those chemicals, right? But if you give the land a rest and start switching it back to more permaculture, which is using mulch. Once our plants come up, we mulch heavily with either, in the garden we're using wood chips right now for around shrubs. Keeps the weeds down, but keeps the moisture in. We put them around the squash, it still worked good. When we tested the soil, we put our finger in, and if it's moist at the tip, then we don't have to water. Because the roots are down there, they're not up top. So why water up top? Hey. But also the way the bed structure is made, it's not just soil, there's a lot of leaf material in there. In the fall time, I gather as many leaves as I can, and we cover the garden with that. That acts like a blanket for the mother. And what happens is in the spring, the worms come up and they eat all the dead leaf material. And then as they go back down, they drag the leaf material in, as well as their waste becomes soil. And so it's a complete cycle. Whereas I find that the permaculture that many people are doing nowadays, it leaves that spiritual and that connection out. And the way I see it, if you're going to do permaculture, if you're not going to do it all the way in, it's like, as I was sharing earlier, it's like going to a sweat and putting your leg in. You know, it's just dipping. You're not getting that full experience of connecting and seeing your land produce native bees, which live in the soil. So if you're tilling it, you're killing them, right? So we don't do that at the garden. And we allow things that birds have dropped in. We'll drop some seeds for us, and we let them grow up, see what it is first before we go yanking it out. If we do any kind of weeding, we take it and we lay it back on the ground as a mulch, as a green mulch, and then it decomposes and puts its energy back to the soil, right? So that's why we don't have a composter, really. The composter that's there is for people in apartment buildings who don't know and don't do vermicomposting, which is using the red wiggler worms to compost your household stuff. And so I don't have any waste. I take garbage out once every 2 months or so. And that's usually very little of, you know, even my tissues, I put that in the composter or, you know, in the soil. Bones from my animals, I put those in the ground. Because why go out and buy bone meal? People buy bone meal at a store. It's like, well, why do that when I got bones anyway? I just let them dry and then I put them in the fire. It breaks down into the wood ash and then I use that on the ground and my stuff comes up pretty good. Same with blood meal. It's a little harder to get blood meal because most people drain out the animal and waste the blood. But the blood has a lot of iron in it. So raspberries, which is a woman's medicine, traditionally they would have put their Menzies blood in there. And the plants would pull it up and make use of it. So one year I had come across a hunter who had some beaver for me. And so I had about 5 beaver heads. And I shoved them in the ground around the raspberries, which we only had like 3 stalks. That's when I first took over there. And within no time, the things were just booming to where I was able to transplant them and make a whole row of raspberries. Right? And then the leaves stay nice dark green. That holds the iron in it. And then those leaves could be used for before your menses time, so that way it doesn't decrease your iron in your body, but it's for everyone. Right? And by picking those first leaves, it allows then the flower underneath to get pollinated, because then the bees can find them. Otherwise, the bees are looking too. Because as we're looking underneath leaves, well, if those leaves were initially picked, then it's a lot easier for them to get pollinated. So there's a whole cycle of care that is far more than just permaculture. It's really observation, what's on your land, what's around you. We made sure that we have a buffer zone at the garden site, as well as others around us. We talked them into getting buffer zones so there can't be any spraying around there. And it just, it's such a complete system that it's self-sustainable. So I can go away from the garden for a month and come back and it's fine, right? And that's what I like, because our people were always busy. And because we were always busy, we did not have time to be sitting there nursing a plant. But, you know, we direct seed. We don't use greenhouse because we find the plants are too dependent, and then they do need to be cared for constantly. Whereas ones that we just direct seeded, they take hold, they find their water and food source in the mycelium in the soil that we've created, and boom, they come up and they're doing fine. An elder out in Nelson House, or Norway House there, had put in a bush garden by how I told them, you know, gathering stuff right from the forest and that humus and loam and sand and mix it together, and then making rows, but not rows, but more mounds, because you can get more on a mound than you can on a flat surface. And also if it over rains, you're not going to drown your plants and such. And so I can get at least 2 to 3 times more on a mound than I can in just one row. The mound has potatoes in the middle, squash on the side, and beans on the other side. If that was flat, I would only be able to do potatoes. It still is a lot easier where I don't have to do the tilling or the digging. It's more at the end of the season where I got a lot of stuff to dry. But I'm only processing that during that short time of the year, right? The rest of the year, I don't have to cut up anything. So it saves my hands from having to use, because I can't use Western knives, so I use the ulu. And it's a lot easier, ergonomic, a lot easier and quicker to cut with, and a lot more versatile than the Western tools. And as for tools in the garden, I usually use a deer antler. It's easy to scoop things up with. It's natural. They found that metal tools actually conduct electricity into the soil. Even though it's a small amount, to a bug, it's probably a lot. So using that instead, as well as the shoulder blade of the bison, female bison, those were used to make hoes. So easy to make one with that. And there again with the deer antlers, you can tie them to the stick and you've got a rake easily, or a thing to scoop up leaves or things. And because the tines are evenly spaced, I can poke that in the ground and then put the seeds in evenly spaced, right? So it's a whole connection between animal and plant life and our life. And the archaeologists figured that the reason why Europeans didn't know about it is because women were the ones who owned the land, in that sense of land stewardship. It wasn't up to the men. The men did the hunting and fishing and what they were told by the clan mothers, but the clan mothers steered the land and steered the growing spaces, which European men did not wish to acknowledge at the time because their own women did not have status at all amongst themselves, right? They were considered chattel, right? But the women were doing all the food processing and gathering and sharing and making sure that there were caches of food out and about to where, like, pemmican would be buried, put into the stomach of the animal, into places where they would mark. So that way, if they themselves came back or another group came, they knew there was an emergency store of food. Off the bridge of Lockport, they have there a dig site that now there's documentation of where they found in-ground granaries. So our people stored things in ground. That's why they couldn't find our stuff, because they were in the ground where it's nice and cool, and they would be lined with sedge grass and willow, and that kept it from getting moist and protected it enough that they were then able to go back, and if they ran short one year, like on a dry year, well, they knew they had stuff in the ground that would get them through winter. But when it comes to our foods, like, it's how they're being used as well, right? And so like with squash, making it into flour instead of just pumpkin pie creates a whole different ball game of things. Like I've coated fish with the squash flour. Oh man, just delicious. You get that nice sweet nuttiness of the squash, and then it just changes that flavor, right? So I'm not eating wheat, but I haven't really been in a store for 13 years because I'm no longer eating that. I'm a lot healthier for it. You know, I lost over 100 pounds. I lost the diabetes, and it's just so satisfying to not have to say, oh, I got to run to the store, or, you know, a snowstorm comes, and it's like, yeah, so what? You know, my cupboards are full, my freezer's full, I'm good. Everything that's on the land is something that you learn from if you choose to, you know. So land-based learning, a lot of people think it's just, they kind of isolate it into, oh, we're just doing hides, or we're making bannock. Sorry, bannock's not native, that's Scottish. And, you know, doing things in what they consider the primitive way, when I don't see it that way. I find it's very intricate, and it's very scientific, it's very beneficial in all ways, but if you're going to do it in the Western method, it's not going to work as well. It's like I said, you know, going to a sweat and putting one leg in, you're not going to get the effect, and then you're going to sit there and blame the sweat, right? Whereas it's not the sweat's fault you didn't get involved and get all the way in. You know, you have to go all the way in and do all the land-based things. So that's food preserving, and not just hides, you know, and not just carvings, but understanding that, you know, not all gardeners are going to be a carver, you know, but if without learning from the earth, you're not going to find that gift that you are a carver, right? And so many people jump into things and they just get little snippets, not realizing there's a whole thing to it. It takes up to 20 years to become a master weaver, right? And our people had cotton here. We had clothing, we had fabrics. We weren't just walking around in hides, you know, and weren't just eating berries and Bambi. Sorry, Bambi. Berries and venison. But we were making use of all things. Even the seed of that, what they call frog leaf or white man's footprint. The seeds of that has psyllium in it, which is like Metamucil. Why to go to the store and buy Metamucil when I got it all right here? And as my auntie said, the plant nation is around the world. To try and segregate and say you can't be here means telling the wind not to blow. Because the wind carries the seed. Birds carry the seed. Animals carry the seed. So to tell them not to do so is disrespectful. You know, the Green Nation is around for everybody. There's mint all around the world, all different kinds of mint. But to say that that one shouldn't be here, sorry, doesn't work with the Green Nation, because everything depends upon it, from every insect to every animal and to us. Without them, nothing on this planet could survive. You know, as I share with my grandson about trees, you know, they produce oxygen and they absorb our carbon dioxide, right? He goes, oh, so they have our farts and we have theirs? Well, if you want to put it that way, yes, basically, right? but knowing when it's going to rain. I watch the leaves of the trees. They turn sideways because they feed from underneath. They don't feed from up top, right? So that you learn that from observing, watching, looking, seeing the differences, not just looking at a tree going, oh, isn't that a pretty tree? Well, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's something that actually needs some help. For all parts of a plant. We don't waste any of it, really. At least I don't. But I try and share that on our Dehydration Nations page to show, like, you know, there's different ways to do things and to think outside the box of what you've been told. But we need to get back that acknowledgement. When people do land acknowledgement, they need to also do food acknowledgement and look at their food and say, how much is it that is indigenous? You know, all of our chili peppers, nobody had the hot stuff until we had, you know, and we grew them. And same as the corn, there's more than just yellow corn, there's pink, there's blue. This one here is going to be a pink one. It has a smaller kernel, but it makes great popcorn, right? But we also boil it with wood ash, and it breaks down the kernel of the corn into producing calcium. It's 90% calcium. That's why we didn't need to have milk. We got it from our corn. So Westerners call it hominy, but and you can get some of the clean wood ash at El Zacco's on Sargent, and she carries the blue corn, the red corn, and a few other colors. And there, it's called nixtamalization. I finally figured that word out. But nixtamalization, and that breaks down the coating of the corn. And then you boil it in that, and then you rinse it and give another boil, and then you can either dry it and make it into flour, which is your masa flour, to make tortillas, best stuff to make it with, as well as we've done it with squash flour. And I just added water and no egg or anything to bind it, and it made a really good tortilla. And it didn't go bad. I kept it in the cupboard as an experiment because I'm a mad scientist when it comes to the garden stuff. Wanted to see how long would it last in the cupboard, and it never went moldy. I was so surprised. I was like, yeah, I like this. You know, stuff that doesn't go moldy without, you know, artificial preservation. Each medicine needs a different type of soil and different type of environment. So forcing sweetgrass, which likes water, to next to sage that doesn't, you're making them fight, you know. And for what? Half the time it's the sage that'll take over because it's okay with the dry. Cedar likes acidic soil, you know, and tobacco likes sweet soil. So why force them into a uniform environment? It just doesn't work, right? It's the same with our people. Why force us into one kind of grouping when we're so diverse? You know, like, I'm a visual learner, I have dyslexia, but when I was a kid, they called me stupid. But I could read backwards and upside down. So I have my talents. But we all do, but we won't know those talents if we're not allowed to find them. And I find by introducing yourself to the land in that way, your body and your spirit will find your talent. It helps to get that back. We need to, because to be relying upon electrical things is a danger. We already have a power grid issue, you know, and a Manitoba hydro issue, and water issues. And those are going to be coming even more so. My auntie told me 35 years ago that be ready, because the time that your knowledge will be needed, you got to be able to share it. We had to hide a lot of knowledge for a number of years because of persecution and denial. Now that we've got science to back up, unfortunately, in another way, backing it up, but we do have it now, saying no, we already were farmers, We already were food secure. We can get back to it again, but we got to get rid of those falsehoods, the myths. We can't have truth and reconciliation without truth first, right? And truth is sometimes hard for some people to swallow, but the way I see it, truth makes a good meal.